What would you think if a teacher, someone entrusted with nurturing young minds, stood before a classroom and humiliated a black boy, not because he misbehaved, not because he lied, but simply because he dared to speak his truth? 11-year-old Malik Rivers was proud to share that his father was Vin Diesel, a man the world knew, but he knew his dad. Yet, instead of support, Malik was met with laughter, sneers, and disbelief. His teacher, Mrs. Bishop, coldly dismissed his words, reducing his identity to a punchline, all because his skin didn't match the image they had in mind. The class mocked him, the adults stayed silent, but when the truth came walking through the classroom door in the most unexpected way, the deep, quiet prejudice that had lingered beneath the surface was brought into the light. Stay with us to witness how justice doesn't always shout, but when it speaks, the whole room listens. The morning air in Greenville, South Carolina, felt heavy, humid with the weight of something unspoken. 11-year-old Malik Rivers stood at the curb outside their modest brick house, adjusting the straps of his backpack, while his mother, Tasha, knelt to check his shoelaces one last time. She didn't say much, just looked at him with that quiet worry mothers carry when they send their black sons into unfamiliar spaces. "You're smart, you're kind, and you belong," she whispered. Malik nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He'd been the new kid before twice, in fact, but this place felt different. Their neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. The first day they arrived, an elderly white couple across the street paused mowing their lawn to stare. Another woman pulled her child inside without a wave or a smile, not hateful exactly, just suspicious, like Malik and his mother had shown up in the wrong movie. The school bus pulled up with a hiss and groan. As Malik stepped on, the chatter inside died down just a little, just enough for him to notice. Dozens of unfamiliar eyes glanced his way, measured him silently, and then turned back to their conversations. No one moved to make room. He took a seat near the back, pressed his bag to his chest, and stared out the window. Brookside Middle was clean, the kind of place with banners reading character counts and tidy mulch around the flagpole. But as Malik walked the halls toward his homeroom, he felt that familiar coldness in the air, the kind that doesn't come from air conditioning. He was greeted not with smiles but with half-glances, quick looks that assessed him and then dismissed him. In room 208, his homeroom teacher, Mrs. Bishop, stood beside the whiteboard. She looked up from her attendance sheet when Malik entered, offering a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was in her late 50s, her salt and pepper bob curled neatly under her ears, her eyes sharp behind reading glasses. "Class," she announced, barely glancing at Malik again, "we have a new student. This is Malik." "Malik," he corrected softly. "Right, from where?" "Atlanta," she said, already turning back to the board. "Find a seat, please. Colin, scoot over." The blond boy by the window didn't move until she barked his name again. He gave Malik a sideways glance, wrinkled his nose, and pushed his backpack aside with a sigh, as if making space was a chore. Malik sat quietly, folded his hands, and focused on breathing evenly. He tried to pay attention, to follow the lesson, to raise his hand when he knew an answer, but each time he did, Mrs. Bishop would glance past him, never calling on him, not once. When he did answer a question correctly during group work, she gave a tight nod but didn't offer praise. But Colin? Colin got warm smiles and chuckles when he stumbled, gentle corrections when he was wrong, and full-throated praise when he got anything right. By lunch, Malik had felt the divide so clearly. He didn't bother trying to talk to anyone. He walked slowly through the cafeteria with his tray, scanning the room for any open seat, but the minute he moved toward a table, kids would shift away, whisper, or suddenly pretend the space was taken. He sat alone in the farthest corner, picking at his sandwich while laughing and cliques buzzed around him. He heard his name once, followed by snickers. He didn't look up. The week dragged, every day felt like a rehearsal for invisibility. He didn't want to cause trouble, he didn't want to be labeled, but he couldn't stop the ache. At home, when his mom asked how his day went, he always said fine and escaped to his room. She didn't press, maybe she knew, maybe she didn't, but one thing she always said echoed in his heart: don't ever let the world convince you you're smaller than you are. Then, on Monday morning, Mrs. Bishop stood at the front of the class and announced something new. Next Friday will be our annual Career Hero Day. Each of you will prepare a short presentation about someone in your family, ideally a parent or grandparent, and tell us what they do and why they inspire you. The room came alive with chatter. My mom's a nurse, my dad builds houses, my aunt's a pilot. Malik sat up straighter. For the first time since arriving, he felt something stir in his chest. He already knew what he was going to say. That night, in the corner of the bedroom they barely had time to decorate, Malik pulled out a worn shoebox filled with keepsakes. Inside were birthday cards, a faded letter, and a single photograph, the one he wasn't supposed to show around. In it, a younger Vin Diesel, real name Mark Sinclair, held a swaddled baby in his arms, his hand resting protectively on the child's back, and the smile on his face wasn't for a camera, it was for his son. Malik stared at the picture, his fingers brushing over the glossy surface. His mother had told him the truth years ago. The world-famous actor had once been part of her life, part of his, before fame pulled him into shadows where secrets became necessary. There were no headlines, no public claims, but there were phone calls, letters, visits that stopped once tabloids began sniffing. Still, he remembered the voice, deep and kind, telling him, "You're stronger than people know." All week, Malik worked on his speech. He wrote and rewrote it, practiced in the mirror, tried to make his voice steady, his words clear. My dad's name is Mark Sinclair, but the world knows him as Vin Diesel. He's my hero because even when he became famous, he didn't forget me. He told me to be proud, to stand tall, and to never be ashamed of who I am. His mother watched him quietly from the hallway, a soft sadness in her eyes. She never discouraged him, but she never encouraged him either. She just said, "Tell the truth, but be ready if they don't believe it." On Thursday, the day before the presentations, Malik carefully placed the photo into a plastic sleeve and tucked it into his folder. At recess, while other kids played, he stayed behind to review his notes. That's when Colin and two of his friends approached. So, Colin said, loudly, loud enough for others to hear, "Who are you going to say your dad is tomorrow? LeBron? Obama?" Malik looked up and said, calmly, "Vin Diesel." For a moment, there was silence, then came the laughter, not just from Colin and his friends, but from a few kids nearby who had heard. Colin grinned like he'd been handed a gift. "Vin Diesel? You're joking, right, bro? Look at you, he's white, he laughed harder. You're like the exact opposite." One boy chimed in, "Maybe your mom wishes he was your dad." Malik felt the heat rise in his ears. He clenched his fists but said nothing. His heart pounded, not with anger, but with shame he didn't deserve. When they walked away still laughing, he pulled the photo out from his folder and stared at it again. The smile on his father's face was still there, just like before, but now it felt distant, fragile, like something too rare for the world around him to accept. For the first time, He wondered if telling the truth was worth the pain it always brought. He had no idea that the next day, in front of the whole class, the truth wouldn't just be laughed at, it would be publicly torn down by the very person whose job it was to teach him. Friday morning arrived, thick with tension Malik couldn't quite name. The sky outside his window remained a dull gray, clouds hanging low, as if even the weather was holding its breath. He dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from the button-up shirt his mom had ironed the night before. He checked his backpack 3 times to make sure the photo of him and his father, carefully tucked inside its plastic sleeve, was still there. He stood in front of the mirror, repeated his lines once more, and told himself this would be the day everything changed. On the school bus, the usual hush followed him as he stepped on. Whispers flitted from row to row, glances shot his way. Somewhere near the front, someone muttered "Hollywood faker" under their breath. Malik clenched his jaw but didn't react. Today, he had proof. Today, the truth would speak louder than skin color. When he walked into room 208, Mrs. Bishop was already arranging the order of presentations, her eyes barely acknowledging him, cold and indifferent as always. He sat quietly near the window, trying to steady his breathing. One by one, his classmates went up to the front of the room. A girl spoke proudly about her mom, a local dentist. Another boy beamed while sharing how his dad worked in construction. Colin strutted up next, his tone loud and confident as he detailed his father's glory as head coach of Greenville High's football team. The class clapped enthusiastically. Mrs. Bishop smiled at him like he was her own grandson. Then came Malik's turn. He stood up, legs trembling slightly, and walked slowly to the front. His heart pounded in his ears, but his hands didn't shake. He placed the photo carefully on Mrs. Bishop's desk next to the notes he had written. A few kids snickered. Colin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, grinning like he was waiting for a joke. Malik took a deep breath. "My name is Malik Rivers," he began, "and my hero is my dad, Mark Sinclair, but you probably know him as Vin Diesel." The class didn't wait, the laughter erupted, instantly loud, merciless, unfiltered. Malik froze. Colin slapped his desk, laughing so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. "You've got to be kidding me," he said. "Vin Diesel, bro, come on, do you even own a mirror?" Malik opened his mouth, trying to push through, but Mrs. Bishop raised a hand to silence the room. The laughter quieted, but smirks remained. She looked at Malik, her expression unreadable, and then, with a sigh that said far more than her words ever could, she said, "Malik, let's not turn this into a fantasy exercise. Career Hero Day is about real people in your life, not celebrities you see on TV." Malik's face turned pale. His voice faltered. But he is my dad." That's enough," she cut him off, her voice sharp, final. "You're not here to play pretend. Sit down." No one said anything after that. There was no laughter left, only an awkward silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Malik picked up his photo with trembling hands and walked back to his seat. No one met his eyes, not even the ones who had laughed the hardest. But the damage was done. His name had become a punchline, and worse, his truth had been denied not by peers, but by the adult who was supposed to protect him. After class, as kids poured into the hallway, Colin walked by Malik and muttered, just loud enough to be heard, "Maybe next time pick someone more believable." Then he laughed and disappeared down the corridor. Malik didn't go to lunch. He sat in the library, hunched over an empty notebook, staring at the photograph like it was written in another language no one in this town could read. He didn't cry, he didn't move. When the final bell rang, he walked home in silence, barely hearing the cars that passed him. His mother was in the kitchen when he got home, chopping onions, her music playing low on the radio. She turned when he walked in, immediately seeing the look on his face. He didn't speak, just handed her the crumpled speech and the photo, then turned and walked to his room. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Tasha sat at the kitchen table, reading every word he had written. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she opened the old shoebox again. Inside were more than just memories, there were truths the world refused to believe. She stared at the photo, then picked up her phone and dialed a number she had stored for years but never used. It rang twice, then a voice answered. "Hello? Mark, it's Tasha." A pause. "Is he okay?" "No," she said, her voice calm but tight. "They called him a liar, his teacher, the kids, all because he told the truth." There was a longer silence on the other end. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said. Tell him he did the right thing." The next morning, Malik said nothing on the way to school. He walked through the halls as if invisible. No one laughed now, maybe the shame of watching someone be publicly humiliated had silenced them, or maybe they thought the joke had already run its course. Either way, they didn't look him in the eye. During homeroom, Mrs. Bishop acted like nothing had happened. She didn't mention the previous day, she didn't acknowledge the damage, she simply passed out worksheets and returned to her desk, business as usual. But Malik knew better. Something inside him had shifted. The part of him that once believed adults always told the truth had cracked open, and what spilled out was not anger, but clarity. At 9:17 a.m., there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Bishop, mid-sentence, looked up, surprised. The door opened slowly, and a tall man in a dark gray hoodie and jeans stepped inside. The room went completely still. The kids stared, some gasped. It was him. Vin Diesel didn't speak right away. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning faces until they settled on Malik, sitting frozen in his seat, lips slightly parted in disbelief. The man smiled softly and walked to the front of the class. "I believe," he said, voice calm but commanding, "there's been some confusion." Mrs. Bishop stood up, blinking rapidly. "Mr. Diesel, I didn't expect." "No," he said, turning to her, "I imagine you didn't. Because you didn't believe him, because my son doesn't look like me, because in your mind, the color of his skin made his truth impossible." She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The room was silent, not just with shock, but with something heavier, guilt, recognition, a slow, painful awareness. Vin looked back at Malik. "You didn't lie," he said. "You told your story, and you should never be ashamed of that." Then he turned to the class. "This young man is my son, not because he looks like me, not because of fame, but because he is mine. And the truth doesn't need permission to be spoken." The students sat, eyes wide, not daring to laugh now. "And Mrs. Bishop?" She lowered her head, lips trembling, the weight of her own prejudice finally settling on her shoulders, too heavy to ignore. The silence that followed Vin Diesel's words didn't just fill the room, it changed it. The students who had mocked Malik, the ones who whispered behind his back, laughed in his face, now stared in stunned silence. Their eyes, once filled with ridicule, were wide with disbelief and discomfort. They were seeing something they never expected, a man they recognized from movie screens standing firmly behind a truth they had dismissed, a truth that didn't fit into the narrow mold of their expectations. Malik sat motionless at his desk, the whirlwind of emotion crashing in waves across his face: relief, confusion, pride, and something deeper, something tender that had been buried for far too long. Mrs. Bishop still stood behind her desk, fingers twitching slightly against the edge of the table, her gaze lowered to the floor. For the first time in years, she had nothing to say. Vin's eyes turned to her again, his voice remaining calm, but there was a weight behind every word. "You looked at my son and decided, without evidence, that he couldn't be who he said he was. You judged him not by his words, not by his courage, but by the color of his skin." She opened her mouth, searching for a defense, but no words came out, because there were none. "If Malik had been white," he continued, "would you have laughed? Would you have called him a liar in front of his classmates, or would you have believed him simply because his skin matched the image you had in your mind?" No one moved, no one dared to interrupt. Vin turned back to the students. "Let me tell you something. Families don't all look the same. Love doesn't follow a single color. And truth doesn't have a face. It doesn't need permission from your expectations. It stands on its own." Malik felt something stir inside him, something stronger than all the shame he'd carried for days. He stood slowly, his knees felt weak, but his heart beat steady. He walked up to the front of the classroom and stood beside his father. The room, once so cold and dismissive, now watched him with wide eyes and uncertain silence. "I didn't come here to brag," Malik said, quietly but clearly. "I didn't say my dad was Vin Diesel because I wanted attention. I said it because it's the truth. But nobody believed me because of how I look, because you thought someone like me doesn't deserve someone like him." He looked directly at Mrs. Bishop, and for the first time, she lifted her eyes to meet his. There was no defiance in her expression now, only shame. "My skin doesn't make my story less true," he said. "And I shouldn't have to prove who I am just to be treated with respect." A long pause followed. Then Vin placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "You were brave, Malik, and I am proud of you." The bell rang, but no one moved. The moment hung in the air, still and raw. Later that afternoon, the principal called an emergency meeting with Mrs. Bishop, Malik's mother, and the school counselor. Tasha arrived in scrubs, hair pulled back, her eyes clear and unflinching. She listened as the principal tried to explain the misunderstanding, tried to frame it as an unfortunate miscommunication, but she didn't let it slide. "My son was publicly humiliated," she said, voice steady, "not by accident, but by assumption. He wasn't just doubted, he was dismissed because he's black, because his story didn't match what you thought was believable." Mrs. Bishop remained quiet, her usual confidence broken. She finally spoke, softly, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I should have listened. I should have trusted him." Tasha didn't respond right away. Then she said, "You owe my son more than a private apology." The principal agreed. It was decided that Mrs. Bishop would address the entire school at Monday's assembly. That weekend, Malik didn't hide in his room. He helped his mother cook dinner, watched movies with her, even laughed a little. Vin stayed in town through Sunday and took Malik to the local park, where they kicked a soccer ball and talked about everything: movies, music, life, and what it meant to be seen, really seen, not just as a celebrity son, but as a full person. Malik asked him, "Why didn't you ever go public about me?" Vin paused, then answered honestly, "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want you caught up in the mess of fame. But maybe I was just protecting myself." Malik nodded. "I don't need people to know. I just needed someone to believe me." On Monday morning, the school auditorium filled with students and teachers. No one quite knew what was about to happen. Mrs. Bishop stood on stage, hands clasped, her expression tense but resolved. She stepped up to the microphone and took a deep breath. "Last week, during Career Hero Day, I made a mistake," she began, "a serious mistake. I doubted a student's words based on my own assumptions. I allowed prejudice, unspoken but real, to guide my reaction, and I hurt someone who trusted me. I am deeply sorry." She turned to Malik, who sat in the front row beside his mother. "Malik, I hope you can forgive me, and I hope everyone in this room learns from what happened. We must do better, all of us." There was a pause, then slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd, soft at first, then louder, fuller. Malik felt heat rise to his face, not from shame this time, but from the strange, overwhelming power of being recognized, not as a joke, but as someone whose truth mattered. In the days that followed, the air at Brookside Middle School shifted, subtle at first, but real. Colin stopped sneering when he passed Malik in the hall. Some kids who had once laughed now waved or offered small smiles. Malik didn't become popular overnight, but he became visible. His story, once mocked, had broken through something deeper than ignorance. It had cracked the shell of casual racism and forced the school to confront the small, quiet ways prejudice shows its face. Mrs. Bishop, too, changed. She asked Malik to help her develop a classroom project on identity and truth, encouraging students to share family stories in all their messy, complex forms. Malik agreed, not because he needed the attention, but because he understood now that change only happens when someone is willing to be the first to speak. A month later, the school held a community night. Parents, teachers, and students gathered for food and stories. Malik stood beside his mom and introduced Vin Diesel to those who came over, not as a star, just as his father. Vin didn't stay long, just enough to shake hands, share a smile, and quietly place a hand on Malik's back before heading out. That night, as Malik lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the laughter, the shame, the disbelief, but also about the moment the door opened and his truth stepped into the room, no longer needing to shout to be heard. He had stood up, been knocked down, and stood again. And now, in the silence of his small bedroom, he finally felt what he had wanted all along, not validation, not fame, but dignity. He whispered into the dark, "I'm not just his son. I'm my own person, and that's enough." And it was, because sometimes, the bravest thing a child can do is speak the truth and wait for the world to catch up. Brought to you by BUP Stories.